Hello everyone, I'm Jasmine Berry, and right now I'm presenting an Artificial Life 2020 accepted article. This work, which was selected for a contributed talk in the Hybrid Life category, is a position paper on the Sensory-Motor Gestalt. This paper provides a concept overview for utilizing Gestalt principles of perceptual organization within the context of exploring sensation and action as the foundations of identity, agency, and self in neuromechanical systems and synthetic biological agents. Before we dive in, allow me to give a quick outline of what will be discussed. First, I'll provide the origin and definition for the Gestalt. Secondly, I'll then introduce our definition of the sensory-motor gestalt, which is constructed from proprioceptive spike trains. Following that is our approach for how self may be abstracted from a neuromuscular systems approach. Next will be a description of the 5 core gestalt laws and a proposal of the computational algorithms that we see fit for each. Lastly, I'll conclude by distinguishing the terms self, identity, and agency while delineating their roles in robotics and biological agents. Here are 2 ambiguous bistable optical illusions. While viewing these, our brains are working hard to achieve stability by taking in multiple modalities of sensory input and making sense of it all. Our visual perception allows us to see recognizable images embedded within, and we can thank Gestalt psychology and principles for allowing us to understand how this happens. If you have ever heard or used the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, then now you can know that it stems from the field of Gestalt psychology. The concept of Gestalt originates from psychologist Max Wertheimer and his partners who were interested in studying principles of structuralism and behaviorism. Gestalt's meaning roughly translates to shape, form, configuration, and unified whole. It aims to reduce complex visual scenes into simpler, less complex shapes that can convey an image's meaning in a single formation rather than smaller elements. Our motivation for applying Gestalt to sensory-motor dynamics starts with limb functions and their transitions from one state to another. Consider the hand and various manipulation tasks such as the power grasp, lateral grasp, hook grip, and precision pinch. Each grip or grasp provides a unique sensory-motor state of high-dimensional afferent inputs and efferent output commands. Our illustration on the right portrays a conceptual manifold of sensory-motor states as a collection of nodes. The transition from one state to another, or in this case from one grasp to another, is only feasibly possible along the sensory-motor manifold. And as indicated with the red X, there are transitions that are not permissible. The actions or tasks that a limb takes from a current state are constrained and bounded by the space of the sensory-motor manifold. It is here that we project the usefulness of Gestalt to be suitable for not only the classification of bodily states from high-dimensional afferents, but their appropriate intermediate transitions. Now let's move on to the sensory-motor Gestalt. The main goal of this research is to propose the underlying mechanisms for brain-body dynamics to merge proprioceptive and motor elements into an epistemological continuum. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and how does one come to know. In our work, we want to determine how one comes to know the self, or at least a minimal version of it. We start by using sensory and proprioceptive information as inputs, which are then quantified and categorized to form the state of the body, or the sensory state. That sensory state is then mapped to the neural activations that prompt feasible motor actions. Those feasible actions inform useful behavior for completing various tasks, which produce a new set of sensory consequences of action. This sequence of sensory to motor to sensory processing is what we hypothesize as key to building up more abstract notions of agency, identity, and self in organisms and robots. Functional utility of sensory-motor gestalt. The figure before you represents our working hypothesis of the sensory-motor gestalt in operation for whole body function. Let each of the X, Y, and Z axes be a sensory modality that is associated with a particular state of the body. Our data-driven projection method categorizes the set of feasible sensory inputs for each specific task performed as a manifold. For example, arm reaching has certain sensory-motor constraints to reach standing, to reach sitting, and to eventually reach squatting. We envision the representation of minimal self as a collection of organized states in real coordinate space, Rn, formed from these sensory and motor maps and made useful by the agency they provide. Next, I'll discuss how the approach of neuromuscular systems build up the foundation of the sensory-motor gestalt. We theorize there are benefits in extrapolating ideas of gestalt laws of perceptual grouping from vision to other modalities of the body, such as the somatosensory system and mainly proprioception. In humans and mammals, proprioception provides awareness of body state through postures and movements. Let's assume that there are n equals 30 muscles in the arm and hand. For the stretch receptors, that would amount to 60 muscle spindles, which measure fiber length and velocity, and 30 Golgi tendon organs, which measure tendon tension. That totals to 90 dimensions for the arm sensory space and an additional 30 motor commands. The result is an ensemble of the 120-dimensional sensory motor space that can classify unique states. How we arrive at the sensory-motor gestalt begins with a look at tendon-driven systems from the Fundamentals of Neuromechanics, authored by Dr. Villela Cuevas. Tendon-driven limbs and musculoskeletal models allow us to inspect the dynamics of movement through various parameters, such as neural activations, muscle forces, torque, and afferentation. In prior work published in IEEE, we have extrapolated the perspective of muscle redundancy to feasible sets of simulated proprioceptive signals. Here we first introduce the concept of trajectory-specific proprioceptive manifolds, which are the unique multidimensional combinations of afferent signals that emerge during a limb movement. We demonstrated that a given moment gives rise to a distinct sensory manifold embedded in the 12D space of muscle spindle information that is largely independent of the choice of muscle coordination strategy. As mentioned earlier, the base data sets will apply Gestalt laws to our proprioceptive data points, specifically the 1A and 2 modalities of the simulated muscle spindle. Using parallel coordinates, we show the 1A and 2 group afferents in 50,000 time samples for the case of a 6-muscle 2-joint simulated planar arm performing the lemniscate trajectory with the endpoint. The coordinates are colored according to the segmented locations within the duration of the lemniscate trajectory. As you can see here, the spike trains from the spindle produce an evolutionary, high-dimensional, time-varying manifold of raw afferent information that is distinct for different arm movements across the task. Here is a closer look at the entirety of the 1A group afferents. The shadow boxes to the left and right of the manifold are scaled down sample snapshots of the data for the deltoid anterior and anconeus muscles, ultimately revealing their specific cluster ranges. These cluster ranges are what we'll be performing our data analysis on. Now let's interpret the sensory-motor gestalt in the form of mathematical encoding for each of the core laws. The purpose of this paper is to determine whether these physiological signals of proprioception follow the laws of gestalt. The brain's neural processing is responsible for stitching together the visual scene of the external world in the primary sensory cortices, and also seamlessly binding raw, multisensory information to project a single unified experience. As an example, with the figure before you, you might observe the various patterns, shapes, and designs. However, your brain is able to reduce the complexities and allow you to see the individual alphabet letters spelling out the word gestalt. This is accomplished with the 5 core laws of Gestalt psychology. Law of proximity. This law groups together objects in space or points on a plane that are near or proximate to each other. This is illustrated in the image on the right, where 3 separate groups of points emerge in black, red, and green based on their closeness. Since the notion of proximity is to associate observed points by measurement of Euclidean distance, then a standard unsupervised algorithm such as the k-means clustering proves to be sufficient for revealing the underlying data structure in this way. Next is the law of similarity, in which elements that are similar in visual appearance in at least 1 degree are more likely to be grouped and organized together perceptually. For instance, in this figure, although spatial distance between each element is consistent, the law of similarity groups the elements of black dots and red squares as separate sets. To achieve this kind of grouping in our proprioceptive data set, we can apply several mathematical metrics. The first is cosine similarity, where we let x and y be two vectors of afferent spike trains, 1A and 2. Next is cross-correlation. It compares the time series of afferent data across tasks. Next, we have magnitude squared coherence, which is similar to correlation except that signals are compared in frequency omega. And lastly, we have Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is a means to quantify the likelihood that the statistics of a given process are similar to that of another. The third law of Gestalt is closure. Closure is the tendency to complete unfinished or partially obscured objects. Essentially, this allows you to view incomplete figures as complete. In the figure, we're able to detect a pattern perception of a green square and a black oval despite the non-continuous outline and presence of gaps. One approach to compute this is Warshaw's algorithm for transitive closure. Alternatively, since the law states that there is the expectation of closure when a fragmented version is presented, we can use Bayes' rule as a formal way to represent such expectation in the case of proprioception. Law of continuity states that objects and points that are collinear and follow the same direction will be grouped together as a whole. In the figure here, we perceive the figure as a green dotted line and a separate black dotted line to the observed fluid connection of continuity and direction. An algorithm that can accomplish this is dbScan, which is density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise. Lastly, we have the law of prognoz, which prompts visualizations according to the simplest form of grouping items. Overlapping shapes may cause ambiguity, but as we see in this figure, this law takes the abstract black shape as depicted on the left and perceptually organizes them into simple, more recognizable forms as is depicted on the right with the colored circle, triangle, and square. A potential resolution is an iterative method such as mean shift clustering. Additionally, we can use dimensionality reduction methods such as independent component analysis and non-negative matrix factorization. Lastly, the role of self and identity. So let's revisit the sensory-motor gestalt more formally. Recall how our intent for constructing the minimal version of self is forming the collection of categorized states from the sensory-motor space of proprioception and motor commands. Neighboring inputs can be merged using the laws of proximity and similarity. Feasible states such as going from sitting to squatting can be determined using the laws of continuity and closure. Once in a particular body state, an agent is allowed feasible transitions to next proprioceptive states through feasible motor actions that will lead to a usually predicted new body state through the laws of continuity and closure. And refining these state aggregates to a more simple form can be done using the law of prognoz, or the combination of these laws on the sensory-motor space may prompt the emergence of a self. Although there are various and often contradictory definitions of the self, for our research, we chose to focus on Oyserman's conceptualization. We infer the self as the ability to consider oneself as an object. It is the focal point of personal account. Agency is responsible for the control of intentional actions and volition. It leads to one's ability to plan and action ownership. Identity, which there can be multiple within the self, is content and readiness to act, and employ mindsets to make meaning. In conclusion, we proposed a sensory-motor mechanism inspired by proprioception in neuroscience by which an artificial self may emerge. We did this by applying Gestalt laws of perceptual organization. One drawback of past implementations of sensory-motor contingencies is that they're unencumbered with understanding the manifold of feasible transitions, which therefore leads to the incorrect perspective that any action is permissible from a given state. Our approach addresses how the sensory-motor self should constrain one's agency and perceptual space to feasible tasks. The applications of this may range from a self-other distinction to social systems for robot-human and robot-robot interactions. And with our preliminary results, we conjecture that sensory-motor agency could be a foundation that enables the emergence of self and identity in artificial systems, which is an evolutionarily plausible order of events. As the theme of this year's conference is What Can Alife Offer AI, I think we're getting a better understanding how cognitive and mental processes in the brain, such as forming identities, our self-models or body schemas, and self-awareness are not just mental processes, but also bodily processes. With this knowledge, we may have a better shot at understanding and emulating various forms of intelligence from both the brain and body dynamic. Lastly, I would like to thank my co-author, Dr. Francisco Valero Cuevas, for his research and contributions. And I would like to acknowledge the funding agencies and partners listed here. If you would like to follow up with me regarding this research, please feel free to contact me at the email address listed here. Thank you for your time.